Good evening and welcome to tonight's Shir. I'd like to start off though with saying a chapter of Tehillim, the Zchus Refuah Shlema for Yoino ben Chaya Brocha. So we'll say chapter Chof, and then I'll put in some tzedakah. If you can also put in tzedakah, in his Zchus he should have a Refuah Shlema. Lam Natseach Mizmel David Ya'ancho Adonai V'Yom Soro Yisagevcho Shem Elehei Yaakov. Yishlach Ezracha Mikodesh Amitzion Yisadecha Yizker Kol Min Chesecha Ve'Eloscha Yidash Nasela Yiton Machachil Vavecha V'Chol Asos V'Yemale Neranan Davishu Asecha V'Shem Eleheinu Nidgel Yemale Adonai Kol Mish Alesecha At Yodati Ki Hishia Adonai Meshichoi Ya'anehu Mishmei Kodshoi B'Gevures Yesha Yeminoi Elev Orechev Ve'elev Asusim V'Anachnu V'Shem Adonai Eleheinu Nazkir Hei Makoru V'Nofolo V'Anachnu Kamnu V'Anis Oidod Adonai Hishio Hamelech Ya'aneinu Yom Kareinu. Go straight to our shilas then. So first of all, the first question was about a mikveh. Is there a requirement to place a mezuzah at the entrance of a mikveh? Obviously, the mikveh chamber itself, where people are not clothed, doesn't require a mezuzah. A mezuzah is only for a room which is a respectable room, whereas where people are undressed is not a respectable place, and therefore does not require a mezuzah. The question is more about the entrance, the foyer, etc. There's sometimes there's a bit of a reception area. Does that require a mezuzah? So this has been addressed by several contemporary poskim. And what we have on the screen is from Shevet Halevi, from Rav Wosner, and he says that nowadays the mikvahs are built with all various sophisticated improvements, and there is a very pleasant welcoming room, a foyer. And at least that should be, in the Gemara in Shabbos talks about the three chambers. There's the inner chamber where people are totally undressed, the middle chamber, and the front chamber where people are mostly dressed. And he says that the foyer of the mikveh certainly is at least the bayis hachitzoin, more likely more than that, because in the foyer, it's not as if people are getting dressed in the foyer. They are fully dressed there. It's more just a welcoming area. And therefore, one should place a mezuzah there. It's not to say, no, don't say, oh, it's just part of the bathhouse, and therefore it's not a respectful place. And then he finishes off, and indeed he says to place the mezuzah with the outer bracha, and that's what he himself did in Zichron Meir, in a neighborhood in Bnei Brak where he was the Rav. So they built a mikveh there, and he did instruct to put on a mezuzah, but because of no one's sleeping there as such, it's not a proper dwelling, so therefore it wouldn't require a bracha, but without a bracha. One of our listeners asked for some information about the background for Avodat Tziyun, and this is question number 2. Some background to Avodat Tziyun being a follow-on to Shacharis, and why on Shabbos and Yom Tov is it relegated to Mincha. So indeed, the term, well, in Avodat Tziyun, it starts off with a couple of psukim. Then we have Kodesh, Kodesh and Baruch, and also Hashem Yimlech Lo'olam Void, which is the equivalent of Yimlech Hashem Lo'olam, which we have at the end of Kedusha. There's an explanation why the different psukim are chosen, but there is a revisit to Kedusha in Avodat Tziyun, and in Gemara it talks about Kedusha de Sidra. So that's the Kedusha which we're referring to, which is after the Shemona Esrei. So some say that the Avodat Tziyun was instituted, so there's idea of following from the Beis HaKnesses, from the prayer, the Beis HaMedrash to the study hall, and that's based on Posuk, Yelchu Michael El Choyel, to go from strength to strength. Therefore, to go from the base HaKnesses, from Tefillah, to go on with Torah. So the psukim, which are in Avodat Zion, are psukim from Torah, from Tanakh, and that's one way of fulfilling the idea of progressing from Tefillah onto Torah. Another aspect of it, which is obviously the Kedusha, the Kodesh and Kodesh, that is for someone who missed answering Kedusha in davening. So then he has the opportunity to make it up, to compensate for missing out on answering Kedusha. But here is a fascinating development over here. I may have once shared it with you over in this shir, and that is the following. We say Kedusha before the Shema, right? Before Yotzei HaMa'oros, we say Kedusha over there. Then we have Kedusha in the repetition of the Shemona Esrei. And then we have Kedusha a third time in Avodat Zion. Now, what is unique about the Avodat Zion Kedusha is that there we are saying Kedusha with a translation in Aramaic, which we don't do by the other Kedushas. And you know that in some shuls, the Chazan prompts the Tzibur to say the psukim of Kedusha aloud, and everyone says Kodesh Kodesh, and the same thing for Baruch Kvod Hashem Im Koimoi. Whereas in other circles, in Chabad, it's not pronounced at all, this saying Kedusha aloud, and also not only Chabad, other Chassidish circles also. So what's the reason for this? Should we say it aloud or not? So here there's a Zohar. You can see the reference there. It's in Chelik Gimel Kuf Chof Tes Amud Aleph, that we have in the first time we're saying Kedusha, we're telling a story. We're describing how the Malachim are saying Kedusha, how the angels are saying Kedusha. It comes along to the repetition of the Shemoneh Esrei, to Chazos HaShatz. At this point, we are saying Kedusha together with the Malach. We say Yachad. So and the Ashkenazi say Kashem Shemagdishim B'Shmei Morim. It's a reflection. We're in tandem. We're saying it together with the Malach. It comes a third time. It's like a kind of a takeover bid that we're saying the Kedusha without the Malachim, and there's the emphasis V'ata Kodesh Yoshev Tehillas Yisrael, that it's the Yidden who are saying Kedusha without the Malachim. So here we have, and so there is a kind of concern that the Malachim may be anxious that there's been this takeover bid, and we want to kind of keep the Malachim a little bit out of the picture, because they may be upset that their Kedusha has been usurped by these Yidden, and therefore there is the throwing in of the Aramaic. That's what the Zohar explains, because it says also in the Gemara that the Malachim detest Aramaic, particularly Aramaic, perhaps because Aramaic is considered the Achoraim. It's like the behind of the Kedusha, of Yolashon HaKodesh, sorry. Whatever that may be, but there is some aversion that Malachim have to Aramaic, and therefore there is the Aramaic in Avodat Zion. So as I said, the more Yakische Welt will say the Aramaic, they'll say it quietly, and the Chassidische Welt will just say the whole lot in a regular voice. But either way, the Aramaic there is kind of to address the Malachim that they shouldn't be mekatrik. What's left to our discussion is why is Avodat Zion on Shabbos and Yom Tov? Why is it moved over to Mincha? And the answer is a very simple Balabatische answer, and that is that Shachris on Yom Tov includes Musaf, includes a full Kriyas HaTorah, and people are anxious to make life easier, so that
We don't hear you. Diane, we don't hear you.
Second more. Looks like he's locked out and it's logging back in again. See you, but
Apologies about that. So I was saying that my source is from a volume all about tefillah, and so the second volume it talks about why it's left for the afternoon on Shabbos. Let's move on to our next question, and that is, so the next question is, and he is unfortunately is a widower.
see you, but I can't hear you.
Can you hear me
We
now?
don't hear.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, Baruch Hashem. Okay, we're back. So here we go. So here's this fellow. He's a single man, and he wants to bench licht because his wife is no longer there, so he has to bench licht at home. He can only bench licht after Plaga Mincha. If the shul are going to start Mincha early, he won't be able to get in time to shul to even for Ma'ariv. He's going to have a struggle to be in time because of him lighting at home. So here's the question: should he go to shul and miss out lighting Shabbos candles, or should he light Shabbos candles and miss out going to shul? That was the dilemma which I was looking at, and I felt quite strongly that the mitzvah of lighting Shabbos candles is his personal duty, Davening with a minyan is a wonderful thing. It's not a, it doesn't compare in chiyuv. It's a very highly recommended thing, but it's not a chiyuv absolutely. And therefore, if there's a choice between davening with a minyan or benching licht at home, then lighting candles at home takes the priority. The problem is that he happens to be also the shliach who is leading the davening, which makes it so much more of a challenge. But that's the story. Right. Let's go on to our next question. Someone's asking. It happened to be that in Beis Chabad last week, so they had by Ma'ariv, they had 10 people for Ma'ariv, and then during Hashkivenu they turn around and one of the 10 people has gone missing. So they've only got 9 people. So the rule about this is that if you started a unit with 10 people and then the 10th person leaves, you can still finish that unit so long as there's a majority, so long as there's 6 people in the room. If a minority have left, you can finish off the unit which you're doing. So the question here is, how do we define the unit for Ma'ariv? Does the Kaddish after Hashkivenu, if there was a minyan at Baruch Hu, can the Kaddish after Hashkivenu be said? So this is really, it's a straightforward halacha in Shulchan Aruch, in Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch Nun Hey, Siman Nun Hey Sif Dalet, and he says, in other words, we're defining units. So he says, at Arvis, so the Kaddish, if there was a minyan for Baruch Hu, so at the beginning of Ma'ariv, they would not say the Kaddish after Shemona Esrei, unless there were 10 people at the onset of Shemona Esrei. But the Kaddish before Shemona Esrei should be said if there were 10 at the beginning of Ma'ariv at Baruch Hu, even though some of them had left. Kaddish after Aleinu is kind of a voluntary extra, and that doesn't come into the, if there's no 10 people, you can't say that Kaddish. But let's come back to the Kaddish after Hashkivenu. Why is that Kaddish put there? Why is Ma'ariv different to Shachris? By Shachris, from Goal Yisrael, we go straight into Shemona Esrei, and we don't want to have an interval. And at Ma'ariv, we have an interval, we have Hashkivenu, and then some people say Yereinenu, then there's a Kaddish. The first thing is that Tfilas Arvis Rishus, that the davening Ma'ariv used to be considered like optional extra, and therefore the emphasis of Soimer Gula L'Tfilah, of not having an interruption between Gal Yisrael and Shemona Esrei, that emphasis is less. This is particularly visible in many shuls where the Gaber will announce on the night of Rosh Chodesh, he'll announce Ya'aleh V'Yovoi after Kaddish, before Shemona Esrei. Alter Rebbe says not to because of a Chashash Hefsek, but the Minhag Olam is, why are they not so worried about Hefsek? Because Tfilas Arvis Rishus. And taking this further, that it used to be, apparently, that people would not daven Ma'ariv in shul. They would just do Birchas Krishma, and then they said 18 psukim, corresponding to the 18 brachas of Shemona Esrei, and those 18 psukim are in the, what you have in Nusach Ashkenaz, Yireinenu. You've got 18 psukim there. They are corresponding to the 18 brachas of Shemona Esrei. They would just do the 18 psukim, and then they would say Kaddish, and everyone would say one another good night. So that was the end of their formal davening, was actually right after Hashkivenu. That's how the Kaddish comes in there. All right, so that's a little bit more about that the background of Yireinenu, and why Hashkivenu is like the end, and that Kaddish is the end of the unit of the first unit of Ma'ariv. Let's move on. Very relevant to so Hashgacha Pratis. I teach a class in the Lubavitch High School, and just throw in that there is a charity fundraiser being done, and everyone is welcome to participate in contributing to the chinuch, which is going on in the moistus here in London. But we learned through this year, we were going through Birchas Hanehenin, and mamish last this past week, which was our last lesson because we now got to exam leave. So we learned about the bracha on the king when you see a king. And so what's the dilemma? Everyone knows that there's a bracha upon seeing a king. So there is here, this on the bottom you have here from the Radvaz, quoted in the Mogen Avraham. He says the following: governors which do not have the yoke of a king above them to override their rulings, they can judge and give capital punishment. So such a governor, you have to say the bracha. Whereas ministers, which are appointed by the king in various cities, then they're not so powerful, and therefore you should say the bracha without shame and malchus. The Qadi, who is the supreme judge, no bracha at all. So from this Radvaz, you get the impression that the power of the king has got to do with whether he can apply or annul a death penalty. Now, Baruch Hashem, in our society, death penalty is not legal, not part of the law system altogether. Therefore, the king doesn't have a power of hoirig b'mishpat, and therefore the king asks the question. Perhaps he doesn't qualify to have say the bracha. So this is where there's these murmurings and people think it doesn't really qualify. So this has been addressed by two contemporary poskim or more. One of them is the late Rav Wosner, and is clearly in his tshuva is talking about the Queen of England. And separately, there's also Lang Leben, Reb Moshe Sternbuch in his Tshuvas Van Hogus, also comparing different types, American presidency and British monarchy, etc. So I'm just going to read, though, what Rav Wosner says. Poshut b'yenai, that even if the monarch, B'yodo is referring to the late Queen Elizabeth, even though she does not have the power to give a death penalty without consultation with the heads of government, however, because he or she is the most honorable in their nation, and they are given honor she'ein dugmosai, incomparable. Therefore, they are deserving of the bracha shenosa mikvodo. And he says, read that Radvaz, the Radvaz which with the Mogen Avraham quoted. And that's the svara that has to be got to do with capital punishment or not. There he's talking about someone who's appointed by the Melech. So then the fact that he's not the supreme authority, he's appointed by the king. So then if he doesn't have the ability to apply the death penalty, then he lacks in his power, etc. But the king himself, that because of the legal system, there is no death penalty, that does not prevent him from being recognized as Melech Be'emes, Hadvorim Pshutim. So Rav Wosner is absolutely confident that we do say a bracha on a British monarch. So contrary to various naysayers, right. Now I'm going to just go to mute all. Right. Now, then someone's, like I see here, there's a couple of points in the chat. I'm told that there is still a death penalty for treason in this country. That's very, very interesting. I was actually thinking about whether Rav Wosner is saying that there's covered she'ein dugmosai. I'm wondering whether the fact that there can be protesters and standing there at a parade and saying, not my king, that kind of stuff, does that take away from the extreme covet which the Melech has? The fact that it's illegal for them to protest in such a despicable way. But, okay. Now, as long as they don't start hacking at my program. Okay, these are anti-royalists. Okay, going back to the previous question, could the gentleman, the shliach, could he light in shul? Well, not before mincha, may as well light after, but is there any point in that? Yes. Now, there is a value of him, if they would have a meal in shul, or even some kiddush or something, that could be a possibility of lighting it in shul. I still felt that his primary obligation is to light at his home, at his residence. But you can light somewhere else. But if you can light in your own home, that's your primary chiyuv. Even if he's eating out, that's also an important point. Whenever people eat out and the time they come home, their candles are burnt out, but they still should be making a bracha on the lighting their home. They should have in mind the electric lights. Whenever you light candles, you have in mind also the electric lights. Right. Rabbi Lou is adding that he believes that the monarch can reprieve a death penalty in, say, Jamaica, if they are still under the monarchy. As far as I know, that was a long time ago. That Jamaica being part of the British Commonwealth. I think it's a long time ago. Okay, let's move on. Right. Now, you might think that this question has got to do with the previous question about entering a church. Not directly. And really the question which was put to me was a woman who's getting close to Yiddishkeit, her father, a biological father, Catholic, he died, was cremated, and now they're doing some kind of service at a church, actually in Italy, and she is asking, can she, for respect of her father, to go attend the service? So how rigid is it about not entering a church? So here on the one hand, we have from Simon Kuf Mem Tes, and the upper quote is from Kuf Nun Zayin, and the lower quote is from Kuf Mem Tes. So in Kuf Mem Tes is talking about entering not the church itself, but the premises, the Chotzer Shel Avodah Zarah. So some say that you're allowed to enter when there's no worship going on. And some say even the Chotzer of Avodah Zarah, you're not allowed to enter at all, unless it's the access to reach elsewhere. But meanwhile, basically, the minig posture is that one would not enter a church, as even the yard of a church. Okay. Then on the other hand, we have here, what is the story if a person is chayiv misa? He's been given a death penalty. Is he allowed to run away, take refuge in a church to save his life? So some say, the Shulchan Aruch says he is allowed to. And some say if it's a time of shmad, where they are seeking to force Yidden against their faith, then he's not allowed to. I think we've discussed this once, and how in the town Yezhin, the chassid of the Rebbe Rashab, whose name was Reb Mendel Chaim, there were pogroms in Yezhin, and he was offered refuge by the vicar or whoever, and he refused, and he was actually killed al Kiddush Hashem. What I found was very interesting, that we know that it says in the Torah that if a person is chayiv mises and he runs to the Mizbeach is like a city of refuge. We all know the story of Yoav, the general of David, when he was guilty of treason, the whole thing with the rebellion of Avshalom. So he runs and holds on to the corners of the Mizbeach. So the Mizbeach was seen as a kind of as a city of refuge. So lahavdil in other faiths too, if a person would be punishable with death penalty, but if they take refuge in a place of worship, they are kind of given safety, that they won't get attacked, they won't be even arrested perhaps, whatever, in a place of worship, which I found that very interesting. So this is possibly the background to this discussion, Shulchan Aruch. Are you allowed to run away for safety into a house of Avodah Zarah? Some say you are allowed to. Now, just to come back, go back a little bit. I do want to address, because a lot of people asking how a very choshev Yid in the English British community was at Westminster Abbey yesterday, apparently, and is there a heter for it, etc., etc. I want to say a couple of things. First of all, he himself published that he did consult with the Beis Din about this. A couple of points about this. If he wouldn't go, there would be another representative, going there of the Jewish faith. And I think we prefer to have someone, and that person would be not necessarily a Frumayid who's faithful to Torah. And therefore, it's, I think, preferable for our need for representation that it should be a Frum person rather than a person who's, and there's no difference in halacha whether this person goes, that person goes. I want to share with you one more thing, though. I once heard from Rav Pikarsky. I did not look this up now, but I remember this, how as far as I remember, he quoted Rabbeinu Hananel. In the first parsha of Shema, we say, V'chol levavcho, v'chol nafshecho, or v'chol mo'idecho. And v'chol mo'idecho is sometimes understood to refer to allude to Mesiras Nefesh. In the second parsha of Shema, it says, V'chol levavchem, or v'chol nafshechem. It does not say, V'chol mo'idchem. And Rabbeinu Hananel says a fascinating insight, that when you have a tsa'ar, when you have an anguish of a community, it has equal weight to saving the life of an individual. So we know that pikuach nefesh, saving an individual's life, overrides everything. So Rabbeinu Hananel is saying that prevention, to prevent a pain of a tzibur, of a community, has got equal or similar weight. And whilst Baruch Hashem, we don't feel that but certainly there is a concern that if there would not be a representation of the Jewish community, it would be seen as a snub. I'm not saying it would be dangerous, but it certainly would be something which would be a discomfort. I think that's a bit of an understatement for the Jewish community if they would be seen as not being loyal citizens. And therefore, I can see, I was not asked to paskin on this, but I can see the justification for someone going in. And it's not as if the person went in any interest, any worshipful interest. On the contrary, he's going there as a representative of a different faith. Therefore, there's no room for allegation of saying, "Oh, he went there to enjoy the service." I once heard from one of the chief rabbis from Israel that he was in Rome and he had to go to the Vatican. Right after he went out, he ran to the mikveh. Okay, let's move on. Right. So here's the question: that during the reading of the Torah, a mistake was found. It was a letter which was misformed, or something damaged. So what do we do then exactly? So here we have in Simon Kuf Mem Gimel, if a mistake is found in the Sefer Torah during the reading, we take out another Sefer Torah and we start from where the other one left off. And you can make up the numbers with in other words, let's say you had given 3 aliyahs on a Shabbos morning, and you still have another 4 aliyahs. You don't have to do 4 aliyahs you don't have to do 7 aliyahs in the new Sefer Torah. You rely on those who were called up in the first Sefer Torah to make up your quota of aliyahs. So there's no need to reread that which was done, and no need to make up the number of 7 aliyahs. There are poskim who do say that you should make up extra aliyahs. Now that's on Shabbos, where hoysofis are allowed. And therefore, they say you should do hoysofis. So the person who's asking me this question was asking, what is the Chabad take on this? Now, perhaps we've discussed this before. There is a tshuva of the Tzemach Tzedek, which was published only about perhaps 45 years ago from manuscript. And here the Tzemach Tzedek very much embraces the view of Tshuvas HaRambam, which says the following, that a Sefer Torah which has a psul, which is disqualified, means that you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of writing a Sefer Torah. It does not mean, it's not an impediment for the mitzvah of Kriyas HaTorah. Again, there's a mitzvah that you should have a Sefer Torah. Like there's a mitzvah to have mezuzah on your door, to have tefillin on your head, there's a mitzvah to own a Sefer Torah. If there's a letter missing, you've missed out on the mitzvah of owning a Sefer Torah. But when it comes to Kriyas HaTorah, that's a separate thing. For Kriyas HaTorah, he says you are fulfilling the mitzvah of Kriyas HaTorah, even with apostle Sefer Torah. And the greatest proof of that is, it says in the Gemara that you cannot do Kriyas HaTorah from a chumash, which means a scroll of Vayikra, or a scroll of Bamidra, etc., because of Koved HaTzibur. It's disrespectful to do Kriyas HaTorah from... Now, if you have a scroll of Vayikra, that means that 80% of the Torah is missing there. It's only 1 out of 5 volumes. And he's saying the only problem is Koved HaTzibur. So that tells us that the idea of Kriyas HaTorah is not totally dependent on the kashrus of the Sefer Torah. Now I'm saying this is from the tshuvas of the Rambam, correspondent, the response of the Rambam, whereas in Sefer Hayad, in Mishnah Torah, he says just the opposite. He says that you're not Yotze Kriyas HaTorah from apostle Sefer Torah. And certainly we follow that Lechatchila. But B'di'eved, when you are in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah and you've read already part of it, so what you've read is valid because of this other opinion, and you don't have to make up your quota. And since Chabad don't do Hoshafas, so then we're not going to call up any extras, even though there may be space to do so. We don't call any extras. As you are middle of reading and you see a psul in the Sefer Torah, so then, to borrow a term, pull over to the hard shoulder as soon as possible. Sometimes you cannot interrupt. There are places in the Torah where you cannot interrupt. You can't pause there. Let's say if it's within 3 psukim from a psucho or stuma, sometimes in the middle of, then there are various places when in the middle of Aseres HaDibros, we wouldn't stop, etc. So there are places where you cannot stop. You stop as soon as possible. And then you do the after bracha on the apostle Sefer Torah. One last thing, and that is, all of this is when you have another Sefer Torah. If you don't have another Sefer Torah, you finish off the Kriyas HaTorah with 7 aliyahs in all in the apostle Sefer Torah. That seems very likely on our vacation, a holiday in a hotel. There's only one Sefer Torah, and you found a psul, so then you finish off Kriyas HaTorah, but maftir, shvi becomes maftir, because maftir is the 8th one, it's extra to the quota. So therefore, the one who has the 7th aliyah will do also the Haftorah. Just finish off on a joke on that one, that there was a special shul of the Amaratzim shul. It was the shul of the, come on, what's the plural of ignoramus? Ignorami? Okay, at any rate, so then there was a fellow who has an aliyah, it was Parshas Kairach, and he says, I think, as far as I remember the Haggadah, Kairach is written with a kof, not with a kuf. He said, oh, you're right. We're going to have to put away the Sefer Torah. But because you're such a scholar, you're going to have to leave the Amaratzim minion. Okay, let's move on. Right. So we've discussed this in the past, but about a chimney stack. Now we're all familiar that the Rebbe Yehuda HaChassid has got an issue of blocking up a doorway, blocking up a window, and if we do have need to block a doorway or a window, we would leave a small pipe, a small passage, and later cover that over, but we wouldn't want to block it totally. And that's got to do with spirits, that if they had passage here, not to block up their passage totally. Then what's the story of a chimney? Does the chimney have the same rules as a window? Now there's a separate issue which we have discussed, separate issue which we discussed in the past about demolishing an oven. If you remember, we had a whole story about someone who had a warehouse, and in the corner of the warehouse there was a matzah oven, which was used obviously once a year, and he wants to demolish it to be able to make space in his warehouse. And there's a separate issue of demolishing an oven, which is quite a strict thing also in Rebbe Yehuda HaChassid. But we're not talking about demolishing an oven. We're talking now about blocking a chimney. A chimney is also obviously a passage from, like a window, going from one to the other. Very interesting. On Shabbos, we had by the Shia, I asked, how do you say chimney in Hebrew? So someone tells me the word is aruba. Now we know the word aruba is used for the windows of heaven, which they mabul when the flood comes down. Aruba is hashemoyim. So a wind chimney is an opening to the heaven, or etc. On it's from one floor to the other. So if you would take out a chimney stack, and it's wise if you take out the chimney stack on the lower floor, it's a good idea to take out the one from the upper floor too. Otherwise, it might come tumbling down sometime, unless you put up special brackets, etc. So now you've taken away two chimney stacks, upstairs and downstairs. Now, between those floors, there used to be a passage, which was in the chimney. And now you block that passage. So you should leave some kind of hole between the two, and then you can cover it over with whatever at a later stage. Now, so this is, in the notes, I have a reference to a Sefer Shmir's Guf B'Nefesh, who talks about this. It's a contemporary Sefer about all these safety issues with spiritual stuff. And he gives a reference to a Sefer of Rav Chaim Falaji. Chaim Falaji, if I'm not mistaken, he was in Turkey, and a very eminent posek going back about 150 years ago, wrote in a phenomenal amount of Sforim. And he writes that I responded to someone who had in his house a stove, and it was used for boiling water for laundry, and this had a pipe for taking out the smoke. It went more than 10 floors up. After several years, he saw it's far too high, and it's made of stone. He was worried that because it's so tall, it may collapse. Now, if he wants to diminish the height of this chimney, and so he's take away some of the brickwork, etc., is there any concern of because of Savasi B'Huda HaChosid, where he says you shouldn't demolish an oven, etc. And so he says that the fact that he's shortening the chimney, that's not a problem, because he's not using that space up there. That's what he says over here. And there's still the access is still there. Therefore, it's not a problem. So what we're seeing here is there is an issue of blocking a chimney. And if you do need to remove a chimney stack, so there is, make sure you leave some kind of opening. That becomes easier if it's just from floor to floor. If you've removed a chimney stack to the sky, then what you're going to do there, how are we going to leave an opening there? It shouldn't have the rain come in. There may be, well, I'll have to talk about it, maybe a way of putting leaving some kind of pipe and just having a cap over it with a vent, like a vent with a protective cap. Right. Here's another question, a practical question, that someone's asking that for Friday evening, they're going to have several female students coming over who've never benched. They don't bench licht on a regular basis. So what they're going to have is, let's say there's 8 of them, and there's the Rebbitzin, and they all have their candles. Each one's going to light a candle, and then they will all say the bracha together. Now, we know that normally a woman, after she's just benched licht, she will cover her eyes and then say the bracha. Now, just to clarify, especially we have our Sephardi representative here. Now, in the Sephardim, the bracha is said before lighting. By most Sephardim, Sephardiyos, to be more precise. The bracha is said before lighting, but by Ashkenazim, the bracha is said after lighting. And in order to have the idea of the bracha is said before the mitzvah is done, the eyes are covered, and in that way, they only benefit from the light afterwards. So here's the question. Is it okay for them to light and then to say the bracha once everyone has lit, along with the shlucha, with the Rebbitzin? So if you looking over here, it says in the Shulchan Rebbe in Simulation Samach Gimel, it says about making the bracha before lighting. Then it says the minhag, in other words, minhag Ashkenaz, is to make the bracha after lighting, because once you've said the bracha, it's as if you're Mekabel Shabbos by saying the bracha. And then he says, in order that there should be the bracha prior to the act, so they make a point of not benefiting from the light until after the bracha, namely they put their hands in front of the flame right after the bracha, or sorry, right after lighting before the bracha, as if to say I'm not having benefit from the light until after the bracha. And this is kind of developed from putting the hands in front of you, blocking the candles, to bringing the highlight the candles over. Sorry, they bring the hands over the eyes. It's all the question is, how important is this? How imperative is it to say, oh, you have to cover, and if you didn't cover, you can't say the bracha because you've already had benefit. That's the dilemma. So what I did say to him, the way it's presented, it seems to be more on the level of minhag rather than a chiyuv. That you might, if you see the candles, you can't make a bracha. It doesn't seem to be that way. It seems to be more as a lechatchila, as a minhag. But what I did say is, she should tell the girls, the students, when you've lit your candle, cover your eyes and just think about Kabbalah Shabbos, and then when we're ready, we'll all say the bracha together, and they'll have a moment to think about, to have a contemplation, meditate a bit. That just to recommend that. But if it doesn't work out, I still think they can make a bracha according to Minhag Ashkenaz. Right. How are we doing? Number 10. Right. Okay. Beautiful. I know that some of our listeners love to hear Pshotim of. Now, there's a famous question: why is the first stanza Malachi Hashores and the second stanza is Malachi Hasholem? Why does it switch? And this is discussed in various places. There's also someone who says that he was in Yechidus by the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said that Sholem can also be farewell. Malachi is bidding farewell to the Malachi Hashores, and then his Sholem to the other ones is welcoming them. Okay, but here there's a very beautiful pshat. It's from a sefer called Chasdei Avos, and he has the following explanation. When Monoyach, the father of Shimshon, meets the angel who tells him he's going to have a child and he should be a Nazir, so he asks him, what is your name? And the Malach evasively says, Lo mozeh tishal lishmi, why do you need to know my name? V'hi peli, it is obscure. It's a wonder, whatever the word is peli. So why did he have to say? He says, I'm not telling you my name. He says, my name is peli. So he says that, and Rashi there in Novi says that the Malach says to him, you ask your name. We are given our name according to the mission which we have to do. Whatever the mission is, I get named according to that mission. Okay. So he says that the term Pele is used in the context of Nazir. It says, Ish ki yafli linder nezer Nazir. The word Pele is used in the, the declaration. Yafli can also mean to declare. So he says, well, who Pele? Because I have been sent for a mission to tell you that the son is your Shimshon is going to be a Nazir. Therefore, he uses the term Pele. You've got to do Pele. What is the mission of the Malochim who come to our homes on Friday night? So there's a Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Kuf Yutes, talks about that in addition to the Malochim, which a person is protected with, etc., but you have Malochim which are Malavin Leila Adam. You've got accompanying Malochim on your way home. Two Malochim, a good one and a not good one. If the Malochim see that the home is all nice, prepared for Shabbos, so then the good one says the bracha that should be like this for next week, and the negative one has to also say Amen. Very well known. So the mission of the Malach is, if he sees it's Shalom, to give a bracha of Shalom. So the term Malachi Hashores, the angel of service, is a generic term. All Malachim are doing service. When the Malach comes to your house and he sees how the house is prepared for Shabbos in a beautiful way, then he says Shalom. He's giving a bracha of peace. Then he becomes Malachi HaShalom. That's the mission which they have to do now. Therefore, now he's called Malachi HaShalom. Until he comes to your door, he doesn't know where he's going to be called Malachi HaShalom or not. When he sees your house is prepared appropriately for Shabbos, then he becomes Malachi HaShalom. They become Malachi HaShalom. Okay, that's this word over here. Till they come to the house, they're Malachi HaShalom. So when they come to the house, they become Malachi HaShalom because their mission is to give the bracha of Shalom. Right. Now, okay, this I was asked on Friday. Now, this is a shul, a Beis Chabad, somewhere in Paris. And you can see here, there's a screen between the shul, the Ezras Anosh in the men's shul, and the Ezras Noshim. And this screen is made up of a kind of perspex, and it's held in place. If you can see by the side picture, it's held in place with bolts. If you can see, these bolts are being shoved in. And his question is, he obviously wants, it's a one-way glass, yeah? That you can see from the ladies, you can see into the men's can't see into the ladies. One of the wonderful things which have been created in the last few decades. So now his question is, can I take this down? Can I unbolt it for the duration of the Kiddush so that the Noshim could also be more, connected with the Kiddush, and then put it back for Mincha? So here's the question. Am I allowed to take away this window and put it back at the later window, panel, etc.? So this was his question. I spent a long time trying to work this out, and on Friday I told him that's not okay to do it, and on Shabbos we spent the shiur going through this halacha, and I still feel that that's the position. All right, so here we have in Shin Yud Gimel, Pekak HaChaloim, the shutter to block a window. It's a luach, sh'ar kol dovar, it's a board or something which is used to block a window. So he goes, the first talks about not being muksa, and then he says, then it's not a problem of oihel. Then let's finish off the fichoch. If this, he says it was not a problem of oihel because it's temporary. But if this shutter is not used to be opened regularly, only on rare occasions, then you would not be allowed to use it, not even for a vertical window, and certainly not for a skylight, because it is adding to the building, which is part of a permanent building. So this addition is a permanent addition. Now, before going further, I'd like to just look at this carefully. Is this a window? Or is this part of the building? I define this. A window is that you want to be able to connect to the outside. And so you have a piece of glass, and you open it to let air in, ventilation, etc., to whatever it may be. I don't see this screen as being a window. It is creating a separation between two rooms, and it's allowing that there should be some degree of visibility. It's a separation. It's a building. It's part of the building. And the taking off is as if it's taking off part of the building rather than just opening a window. I know you might think I'm just nitpicking, but I feel that that's the reality, that it's not. It doesn't really qualify as a window. And you'll see now why I'm so concerned. So later in that simon talks about, instead of a window, it starts talking about a doorway. And it talks about a panel which is lifted. It's not on hinges. It's a panel which is lifted in place and used to close the door. And he says, first he talks about if it's only used occasionally. Then he says here, if it's used regularly, even though there's no hinges, but since it's used to be open and closed regularly, that's not a problem to put that door in place and to remove it on Shabbos. And then he says, that's only a couple of conditions. It would have to have a threshold, a raised threshold. It shouldn't look like you're putting a board repairing a wall. If there's no threshold, it looks like, yes, there's a wall, there's a gap in the wall. You put a board there to close up the wall. So he says it has to have a threshold. And then he goes further. If it's one large panel, and then you wouldn't be allowed to use it on Shabbos because it doesn't look like a door. So, and even if there is a threshold, it's not okay because it looks like you're repairing a gap in the wall. So, I mean, going back to this, is this closing a window, opening a window, or is it putting the wall back in place. Now, my feeling is it's an act of building. Not saying it's also in our Torah, but I don't think it's okay. Now, further in that simon talks about a door of a structure, a chicken coop or something, a door of a house, which is connected to the ground. Then you're not allowed to remove that door. Anything which is attached to the ground, removing it is considered demolishing, and putting it back is considered building. So we've discussed it before. You have these kind of hinges which don't interlock, but they are like spindles. There's a spindle on the wall, on the door frame side, and then the one which is on the door is like a slot, as a socket, and it sits on the spindle and it rotates that way. So to lift such a door is not, or to put it back is not allowed on Shabbos, and he expels it out. This, which when they have large celebrations, they take off the windows, and they ask a goy to take off the window. That's not okay. And it's a chiyuv chatos. And those who say that demolishing, which is not going to make it better, is not a melacha, so then it's not a sumin HaTorah, it's the rabbanon. Bottom line, he says, those who do so, asking a goy to do it, yesh lahem al mashi yismochu, but a person should be machmir, like the first shitta. And then he finishes off about people who are nichshal, that they take off revi yos hachaloinus, shekoirin kvatirin. What exactly are these kvatirin? I saw in one of the contemporaries for him suggesting that they would have windows made of 4 parts. And that's what they mean by the kvatirin, they're made of whatever. But certainly to remove a window from a window frame is not okay. Now, what happened over here? Before, there seemed to have been room for, at least for the window to be lifted and put back. And why all of a sudden here has become us? The simple answer is that here he's talking about where they are actually fixed. Earlier, where he talks about having a board to put in place, it's a freestanding board, and you're going to put it somehow secure it there. If Yud Zayin is talking about when they are actually fitted in a permanent form, there to remove them would be possibly a melacha min HaTorah. At least it's going to be a melacha min Rabbanon. So that doesn't answer our question necessarily. And it goes back to the question: is that screen a window, or is that screen a wall which can be removed for convenience, etc.? And I'm more inclined, contrary to my usual disposition to try to find heterium, I'm more inclined to say it's not okay. Finally, last week, or was it 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the lady who realized that her glasses are perched on her forehead when she was walking the street, and how to stop and put them onto her nose, or to put, if you put her nose while she's walking, wouldn't help. And I mentioned that someone of Rabbi Riddle Weiss had suggested that if you put it down on a mokim p'tur, then you'd be allowed to. Let's say again, you found something on your person on Shabbos while walking the street. So one way of solving the problem is if you put it down on a mokim p'tur, and I gave an example of a bollard or something which is less than 4 tefachim square, to put it down on that would be a solution. So someone pointed out a very important point. You'd have to put it down on the bollard whilst you're still walking. If you stop and put it down, well, as soon as you've stopped, so you've already done hanochas gufa, hanochas chayfetz. When you stop, it's as if you've put it down already. So the heter of putting it down on a mokim p'tur, on a bollard or something like that, would only be if you manage to do so whilst you're still walking, albeit slowly. And then once it's there on the bollard, then you've kind of aborted the melacha min HaTorah, and then you could then take the glasses, let's say in this case, and put them onto your nose, wear them normally. If it was a yarmulke, you could then take it and put it on your head and wear it. That would be okay. Someone's asking about the window, screen, whatever. Would it be slid sideways? If the screen had been in a frame with sliding, with a track, that would not be a problem at all. That's actually an interesting suggestion. I can tell the shliach, if he wants really to improve upon this this situation, to allow opening it on Shabbos, if instead of it being bolted the way it is, if you get it made into a sliding screen, that would solve his problem. Okay, I wish you all a good night and Sudas Tovos, and just join me again. Refuah Shlema to Yoino ben Chaya Brocha. Refuah Shlema Okrev. Out.
Shkoyach.